Good morning, my dear students. Yesterday I gave you a brief introduction of the chapter The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. Now I hope you've understood the summary of the chapter. Now today I am going to start the reading of the chapter word by word, and please be very careful while reading, because reading really makes a difference. If you read the chapter properly and understand it, then question and answers become a cakewalk for you. Now this is a story about Khushwant Singh's grandmother, how he spent his time when he was a child with his grandmother, and how his relationship with his grandmother deteriorated with time. This is what is explained in this story. Now my grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. So he says that my grandmother, like any other grandmother, was an old woman, and she was the same, old and wrinkled, from last 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. So he says it was very hard to believe when people told me that your grandmother was very young and she was beautiful and she also had a husband. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. So he says that my grandfather's portrait used to hang above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. So he says basically he's trying to tell us that his grandfather portrait showed that he was almost 100 years old, because he had a white beard and he used to wear big turban and loose fitting clothes. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. So he used to look, in that portrait, he used to look so old that nobody could believe that he had a wife and his own children, but everybody could believe that he had lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. So he says that I could never believe, the very thought was always revolting, that my grandmother was also young and pretty once. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child that seemed quite absurd. Absurd means strange and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. So Khushwant Singh is trying to tell us that it was very hard to believe the way she used to explain the games which she used to play as a child, and they always treated those stories, those experiences very strange, and they used to always treat those experiences as fables. Fables means tales, stories of the prophets she used to tell us. She had always been short and fat. Now he's telling us about the grandmother, that his grandmother had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. Everywhere to everywhere. So basically he's telling us about his grandmother, that her grandmother was short and fat and was slightly bent, and her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. So he says that we had known her grandmother the same way. She was old and very old, and we had been seeing her from last 20 years in the same way. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. He says that she could have never been pretty, but she was always beautiful. What does this mean? He means that she was very beautiful from inside. She was a divine beauty. She hobbled about the house, means walked with difficulty, in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Now he says that she was very beautiful from inside, though she was never pretty. He thought she was never pretty, but was very beautiful from inside. He says she hobbled about the house in spotless white clothes, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop. Stoop means the bent which she had, and the other telling the beads of her rosary, and the mala which she used to carry. In the other hand, she had the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily, means her silver hair, her white hair were scattered untidily over her pale puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Inaudible means which could not be heard. And her lips, what were her lips? They were always moving constantly with inaudible prayer, which could not be heard by anybody. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. Contentment means satisfaction. So she was absolutely beautiful from inside, though she was not that pretty from outside. And she was like a winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, means she was a symbol of pure white serenity. Serenity means calmness, breathing peace and contentment. And she always used to breathe peace and contentment, always in a peaceful and satisfied state. I hope this is clear to you. This is the whole character sketch of the grandmother which Khushwant Singh has given, and this is a very, very important paragraph, my dear students. If you have to write about grandmother, you will pick up the content from this paragraph. I hope this paragraph is absolutely clear to you. Now moving on further, my grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. So he says, Khushwant Singh says that my grandmother and I were very good friends because my parents left me when they left for city, and we were constantly together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song, in a very boring. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous. What do you mean by monotonous? Boring. Sing-song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. So he says that she used to recite her morning prayers in a very monotonous, in a very boring sing-song manner, and she made me bathe and dress up with the thought, with the hope that I would listen to her prayers and I will learn it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice but never bothered to learn it. So Khushwant Singh is saying that I used to always listen to her prayers because I used to like her voice, but I never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle and hand it to me. Then she used to pick up his wooden slate, which she had already washed and had plastered with yellow chalk, and a tiny earthen ink pot she used to pick up, and a red pen, and tie them all in a bundle and hand it to me because I was ready to go to school. After a breakfast of a thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis. Stale means rotten, which basi basically. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. So she used to carry several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. So she used to always go to drop him to the school because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer, while the children sat in the rows on either side of the veranda, singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. Chorus means in a choir. My grandmother sat aside reading the scriptures. So when we used to learn all these things, the alphabets and the prayers in a chorus means in a choir, his grandmother used to sit reading the scriptures. Scriptures means like Ramayana, Mahabharata, Gita. These are all scriptures of Hinduism. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. So basically when the school used to get over, the grandmother used to return with him back, and there were dogs in between near the temple door which used to growl and fight with each other for the chapatis we threw to them.